as we come up on Halloween, I feel like in church world, especially if you've grown up in church world, every year it starts to open up some of these questions about like, what does the church think about Halloween? And in church, do we do Halloween? And there's a lot of different opinions. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then it brings up, with Halloween, it's not just the holiday, right? But it's then all the things that I think don't exist year round, right? Like people talk about magic year round. People talk about all these different, there's psychics that are operating year round, whatever it is. But for some reason, right at Halloween time, it's when Christians get all concerned about it, and voice all their opinions. And so we've just never had a chance here at Dwell to like just really outright address that for you. And it can be really confusing. And so God really laid it on my heart to kind of answer some questions as people were asking them, but then also just as a parent, what do we do? What's right? I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to try to give some of them. So last year, I'll start with this. Last year, Balin, our oldest son here, I didn't tell you I was telling this story, but he came home and he loves Halloween, right? He's a big fan. It's fun for kids, right? You get candy. Our kids love candy, but they really love to dress up. But he came home with this like dice thing or something that was like the elements of Halloween, and I'm going to butcher it. He worked really hard on it. It was very creative. I don't know, it was a piece of paper with a bunch of stuff he had drawn on it. And he's like showing me like candy and pumpkins and costumes. And then he flips it over. And honestly, as soon as I see it, my stomach kind of flipped because on the other side, on the fourth side was Satan as like the pillar of Halloween. And I'm realizing in this moment that like, he has reached a point where he believes that not only is like Satan some of the foundation of Halloween, but then because we celebrate Halloween in our house, does that mean that we're like cool with Satan? Like this is a thing to be glorified or whatever it is. And so I had a few options in that moment, right? As a parent, how do you address something like that? And I feel like what I've seen from several parents, and I think I can be honest, I've done all of these responses myself, is a couple options. So you can like really freak out and punish the kid and not, say, give some sort of like, better, vague type of answer, right? And leave it at that. And then the kid's in trouble and confused and doesn't know what's happening. You could minimize it and just say something really simple like, we don't do this in this house, or because I said so, type of like a lack of actual response. Or, and I think this is what we did in this scenario, is you can sit down and you can have a conversation about, hey, this is, as mom, this is what seeing that made me feel. This is what we're thinking about it, and why in our home we're not going to glorify Satan, And so I think that's what we did with this one. And that really kind of resonates with mine and Eric's typical parenting style. And so it may not be other parents in the room, but our parenting style revolves pretty heavily around allowing our kids to experience life, experience the world, and then being there to let them ask questions and have conversations and guide their thought process in our home's belief systems. They do several things that I think there's a camp of Christianity would tell you is the wrong thing to do. They attend public school. We love it. I will never not do public school. They learn about evolution. We give them permission to participate in every type of sexual education that happens in the public school. And then we, as their parents, come alongside that and say, this is what we think about this. We stay involved enough to know when these things are happening, what they're going to learn about, and then we share our belief system that partners with that. So that is how we do it. But I was coming across this Halloween last year, right? This 4 elements of Halloween, and realizing like we've done good work in those areas. We've been proactive about things like sex education, and we even talked about Santa Claus growing up. And I think Eric and I did have a couple, when Balin's first Halloween came up, we had a couple conversations about like, okay, what do we do with Halloween? But not enough in our infinite wisdom as parents to actually address like magic and the other topics that come up around this time, like ghosts and demons and all these other things. And what do we think? And so in that, even last year, I don't know that I did the best job addressing it as a parent. I think we had this like one moment, and then I was like, okay, let's move on. No, we gave you an explanation and never really came back to it. So I've been doing a little research on Halloween, right? And how we got here, because Halloween is a pretty like uniquely American holiday, right? So like, where did it come from? Well, every culture almost in existence has this like Day of the Dead type holiday. And so I think for me, I know about it mostly from like Mexican or Latino cultures, but it exists all over the world. There's Asian cultures, European cultures. They date back to a really long time. And at some point, actually about 600 AD, the church, the Pope at the time said, we don't celebrate the dead, so let's have All Saints Day, which is All Hallows Eve. That's where Halloween gets our name. And so they created this way of like, yes, we'll celebrate the dead, but specifically saints and martyrs. Because we can't celebrate all the dead, we can just celebrate the ones that were positive towards the church. And I think this is important because the church has been doing this for a long time. The church has said a lot of, okay, this thing exists out in the world, and instead of being a part of it in an educated way, we're going to create our own separate thing over here. And today, this is formulated into harvest parties and trunk or treats and, things that are not inherently bad, but pull us out of the world. So, did anyone grow up in a house where you didn't get to trick or treat? Yeah. That's what a rough childhood. Oh goodness. Yeah. So it's an interesting way. And I think that we, because of all this confusion from the church, because of the vast amount of opinions, I think it can be really hard to like hone in and find the actual like biblical response, right? Because Halloween is not addressed in the Bible. Specifically, when we get to these things that have evolved over time that didn't exist in biblical times, it's a really big question of, oh, what would the Bible think of this? So I think there are churches that land in a couple different camps, and I'm going to go through this really quickly because it's not like the biggest thing I want to talk about today, but I'm happy to have further conversation with anybody. But I think churches tend to land in one of these three areas. From what I've seen, this is a generalization for sure. But viewpoint number one, any participation in Halloween is of the devil, and you're immediately going to go to hell if you participate, right? That is one of them. I can promise you will find no biblical backing for this. Not a verse. Like I said, Halloween is not there, so you won't find it. And I believe firmly that this attitude isolates or attacks the people that are outside of the church and makes them not want to come. The second thing is that this holiday presents an opportunity for our kids and families to potentially get themselves into unsafe or uncomfortable situations. I think a lot of churches actually have landed here, not that they think Halloween is demonic in and of itself, but they are worried about all the things that have a tendency to come alongside Halloween, and are my kids going to be safe? And then within that, I think there's even two more camps. One that lean towards like, where if you're really into Halloween and you come to our church's harvest party, but you're in like the wrong costume, you're still going to feel as unsafe as if you were trick-or-treating around. Or the ones that genuinely just say, I want our kids to be safe. I want them to have fun. I want them to have a good time. Let's make this service to our community, but it's really hard to tell where these churches land. And then I think the last one, honestly, is churches that choose to ignore it, take no stance on it at all, provide no direction, and it leaves our churchgoers and our parents kind of floundering to make their own decisions, which is like making your own decisions is really great, but there is some like guidance that is super helpful to try to figure out how to perceive this thing that is not represented in the Bible at all. So, a very quick rundown of the most commonly asked questions I hear about Halloween from Christians. Is Halloween demonic? In and of itself, no, it is not. However, it is important to be aware that some people do utilize this time of year to glorify practices that are demonic. And so it becomes a little more prevalent. It's a little more you need to pay attention. There are people out that actively practice Satanism, the worship of the devil. That's a real religion that people follow and go around. There's witchcraft. There's all kinds of different things that the Bible does have some views on those specific things and would say, hey, we don't do that. So it's important to be aware, to make a plan, to know how you'll address this with your family and in your home prior to Halloween, prior to it coming up, so that you can have a good answer and know what you're going to say. All right, can I take my kids trick-or-treating? Yes. 100% yes, your kids can trick-or-treat. Be fun, have fun, be safe. And like, really, that's the end of the story, okay? Can my kids wear costumes? Yes. There is no like direct language of like not dressing up in the Bible. It is fine for your kids to wear costumes. Here's where I feel like it gets tricky, and this is a lot more like open to interpretation. Should I limit the costumes that my kids wear? I might have a frustrating answer for you, but make your own decision. This is up to you. But explain your choices to your kids. This is my one like caveat. If you make a decision for one reason, explain your choices. So Pastor Aeric grew up in a home. They didn't trick or treat. They didn't dress up. They kind of just didn't do any of it. I grew up in the home where we did all of those things, but if I asked to be a witch, it was not going to happen. If I asked to be a monster of some sort, I'm really kind of unsure if I had wanted to be like a villain from a show or something where we would have landed on that. I don't know if I ever did, but unlike my kids, I didn't love the villains all the time, so I don't know. But if it helps you, this year in our house, we have a dinosaur rider, we have a Hot Wheels racer, and we have what has been described as a psychopathic mass murdering clown called the Joker. So that is what Balin has decided to dress up with. And, you know, in my home, I don't think I would have been allowed to dress up as the Joker, right? But why are we okay with this costume? If I'm being really, really honest, in our house, the large majority of entertainment surrounds super beings that have extra powers or magic or fantasy related to it. Whether it's every single Marvel movie ever made, witches and wizards and Harry Potter's, you know, other gods from other belief systems and Percy Jackson, or magical beings of Lord of the Rings or romantasy novels, whatever it is, we spend a lot of time diving into stories in our house that are not centered around what actually exists around us or our firm belief system, right? What? My pastors? I've got to be honest. I have had more than one conversation with people who have said that because I love Harry Potter or because Eric loves superheroes, we should not be pastors. More than one occasion, it has been taken to leaders above us as well. And to be honest, if this is a sticking point for you, this church led by a couple of nerds covered in tattoos who are going to continue to watch superhero movies and read Harry Potter may not be for you. And I have a lot of prayers for the next pastor that you're going to be under, that they can handle the lack of grace and judgment that you're going to take with you when you walk in the room. Okay. It is a thing that we like to do, right? As we judge the outward appearance, we judge the hobbies with no context to the interpersonal relationship or development with God that might be going on into our home. So it's irrelevant, you know? It is something that doesn't have the impact on what we do here unless we let it get fully out of control, unless we let it consume our lives. So here's the big question. Where does this leave us on the view of magic, right? So my church growing up, we did a 3-part series when the Harry Potter books released on how you are a bad Christian if you choose to read these stories. Let me pause for a moment as I drink from my Harry Potter cup. So at this point, my mom, my sister, and I had already all read the first book and loved it, and were like chomping at the bit for the second one to come out. Like, we could not wait. And so these messages, they didn't do anything to change whether or not we were going to continue to read the series. What they did is they made us start to hide our life choices from the church we were attending. Consuming entertainment that deals with magical principles is not going to send you to hell. It's just not. But in our world, there are many people who take magic off the page or off the TV and begin to incorporate it into their real lives. And that's what we want to talk about today. So I think it's important to know magic is a way that many people have decided to deal with life in a broken world as an attempt to make it make sense. So even before the fall, When Eve plucked the apple from the tree, humans have been trying to make sense of things that we were never supposed to understand, right? In a world filled with sin, it's become more and more difficult for our brains to follow, for our brains to understand what is happening. And so it's our human nature to want to control everything around us, to control the situation, to be able to influence our circumstances in ways that we weren't supposed to. God placed us as overseers of this world, but there's also snakes all around trying to convince us that we should know and understand more than we do. I want to look at real quick in Genesis how this played out. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat the fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat the fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. You must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will certainly not die,' the serpent said to the woman. 'For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" I think a lot of you know what happens next. Eve chooses to eat the apple, then gives some to her husband, and Adam and Eve, they begin to see the world differently. They begin to see things and their brain starts to grapple with things that they couldn't understand. One of their first reactions is, "Oh man, I'm naked. I should cover that up." They'd never noticed it before. Fast forward thousands of years later, and here we are still trying to figure it all out. So when we're talking about this, when we're talking about the term magic, what do I mean? I think it's important because that's can mean a lot of different things to different people, right? And so when I'm using this one word magic today, I'm talking about a series of things. So it's a term for any practice that suggests a source of power that is not coming from God, our capital G, God. And this can include, but is not limited to, witchcraft, spells and charms, working with crystals and amulets that are said to contain power, astrology, tarot, palm readings, mediums, psychics. This is certainly not a complete list, but I also want to clarify a couple things that are very intentionally not on this list. So, there's some practices that have been known to incorporate aspects of magic at times, but on their own are not necessarily magic. Things like yoga, things like meditation, things like adult coloring. These have been, pretty heavily attacked over the years. But really, if you look at yoga, stretching and breathing is really, really good for you, and your body needs it. And so just because someone somewhere incorporates, a different level of worship or, glorification of things that are not God in that, doesn't mean that yoga itself is bad. You are not going to, if you color, what is it, a mandala or whatever in an adult coloring book, you are not going to become possessed by a demon. Now, if you color in an adult coloring book and you start praying to Satan and you start doing all these other things with it, then you're opening yourself up to something different. But if you color in an adult coloring book to relax or yoga, and maybe you during that time are praying or you have worship music on in the background, you might actually also open yourself up to more of God and what he wants to do in your life. So let me say this as clear as I possibly can, and then I'm going to explain it. Here is what you can know about magic. Number one, magic is not made up. Number two, magic can be very powerful. And number three, God's power is much, much bigger. So magic is not made up. There are real forces in this world, other supernatural forces that don't originate from God, our capital G God, that can work in ways that exist beyond what makes sense in our head. We weren't supposed to understand it, right? These forces, number two, they can hold real power, if none other than the power to overtake your life. But I think there are enough unexplained phenomena throughout the world to acknowledge that there's real things that happen, that there are more supernatural forces at work. Number three, This is the most important thing to take with you from the day. God is the ultimate power. While there are other deities in existence and entire cultures centered around worshiping those other deities, the God of the Israelites, the one we're here today to learn more about, to grow closer to, will always win. So we can see God's view of magic as he's preparing the Israelites to be freed from an oppression under Babylon. Babylon was a culture that was built on worshiping several of these spiritual forces as their gods. And he speaks through his prophet Isaiah. And when we read this, I'm going to read this using a certain intonation that I've gathered from the rest of the context of the story. So I'm not just placing my own thoughts and opinions on this today, but Isaiah wants to make it very clear that he, God, is in control, and any other deity or practice of magic is useless in this scenario. So it says, Isaiah 47, 12 through 15, it says, "Keep on then with your magic spells and with your many sorceries, which you have labored at since childhood. Perhaps you will succeed. Perhaps you will cause terror. All the counsel you have received has only worn you out. Let your astrologers come forward, those stargazers who make predictions month by month. Let them save you from what is coming upon you. Surely they are like stubble. The fire will burn them up. They cannot even save themselves from the power of the flame. These are not coals for warmth. This is not a fire to sit by. That is all they are to you. These you have dealt with and labored with since childhood. All of them go on in their error. There is not one that can save you." This show of power alone, it wasn't quite convincing enough. There's a few times in the Bible that God goes up against other cultures that value magic. And like I said, people turn to magic when they can't make sense of the world. So this Babylonian culture, they see a lot of things going on. They're trying to establish themselves as power, but they really don't have the right thing to continue to be powerful, because spoiler alert, God's about to wipe them out in this next little bit. But they turn to magic when it can't make sense. Maybe it's less that the world doesn't make sense, but that magic feels like the easiest or the most convenient path to whatever result we're looking for. See, here's what I want you to know, that whatever hard thing in life that you might be trying to process through something more convenient or magical means, there is a more biblically aligned alternative. So that's just one example, but I recently attended a conference and I was listening to this man. His name is Dr. Robert Niemeyer, and he's brilliant. He's known as like the expert on dealing with grief in the world. This conference, it was for people who had lost someone to suicide, and now they have trying to help other people who are experiencing this loss, this very unique, heart-wrenching loss. And he's talking about the different ways you can deal with this. And he talks about art therapy and counseling and peer-to-peer support. And he talks about this chair method that is as simple as sitting down and looking in the chair next to you and saying, whoever it is you lost is sitting there and you need to have a conversation with them. What really struck me through this is you don't need a Ouija board to process an unfinished conversation with someone you've lost. You don't need these tools that culture has added into it. As we've already said, magic is not made up. The practice of it can have real effects on our circumstances or the world around us. But because this power and change is not derived of God, its power is limited, and at times the effects can be devastating. Let us look at another instance where God goes up against magic in the Bible. You may have heard where Moses goes toe-to-toe with Pharaoh as he's trying to free the Israelites once again from an oppressed culture. The Egyptian culture was also one that had many, many gods, again, lowercase g gods, and it was guided by the sorcerers and what they considered to be an actual god living among them in the man named Pharaoh. It was a culture so vastly different from the one that capital G God had intended for the Israelites, yet they lived under its rules and practices for so long at the mercy of its leaders. In order to establish dominance over Pharaoh, God would need to show the vastness of his power and make certain that the Egyptians, but also the Israelites, understood that without a shadow of a doubt, his power and authority could beat their magicians, God and gods, time and time again. So let's look at Exodus 7. This is the beginning of it. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Pharaoh will demand, show me a miracle.'" That's the value, right? That's what Pharaoh and his culture is going to value. Show me a miracle. Can you do this? Show me a miracle. When he does this, say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it on the ground in front of Pharaoh, and it will become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron, they went to Pharaoh. They did what the Lord had commanded them. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a serpent. We'll do the next slide. So then Pharaoh called his own wise men and sorcerers, and these magicians, they did the same thing with their magic. They threw down their staffs, which also became serpents. But then Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. This was the first in many shows of power, and this alone wasn't convincing enough. Pharaoh was not willing to release the free labor that had built their society to greatness, right? It wasn't going to be just one little easy moment. So as the confrontation continues to build, we see God, our God, capital G, bring down a series of plagues in the land of Egypt that are these astonishing shows of power. And they are specifically intended to bring an individual defeat to each of the gods the Egyptians worshipped. So water turns to blood, and it overpowers the god of the Nile that they've been worshiping, that gives them life. Frogs begin to pour out of that very same river to mock the goddess of fertility who has the head shaped of a frog. And then the livestock die, and this humiliates their goddess of love and protection, depicted with the head of a cow. And these go on and on and on until we read a scene that each time one of these new plagues is coming, it's really interesting that God is not just sending the power, he's directing Moses and Aaron to take an action that mimics that of the sorcerers. So Aaron turns his staff to the snakes, and then the magicians do the same thing. God is showing them, I can live in your ways, but I'm still more powerful. And so he has Aaron and Moses do each of these actions until eventually the magicians themselves are standing before Moses, covered in boils because they cannot protect themselves from the overwhelming power of God that we serve. This shows us something. The vastness of the power of God is intimidating. For thousands of years, magic has provided the illusion to those that do not accept him that they too are powerful and can have control and control the events of the world. For you, maybe magic is not the tool that you're using to grasp power in your life. You'll notice that while in the Old Testament there's a lot of references to the magic arts, in the New Testament this virtually becomes a non-issue. You won't see it anywhere. And so it makes it harder for us even today. If it disappears that quickly in the scripture, how do we know today what to do? And the reality is that magic is not addressed in the New Testament because there's been a shift in power. Where in the Old Testament, power was derived from these other gods, these other deities, and these acts of anomalies, abnormalities that magicians and sorcerers could create. In the New Testament, power all lives in the political. We see Rome come, and it's a structure that has influenced our world today and continues to. And though it's morphed over the years, especially in a digital age that allows us to research what happened before, and so we start to see this blend of like the political power that has really come up, but then people pulling more and more from these spiritual practices from other cultures around the world or times that we don't see. We see this combination and this like fascinating dichotomy of spiritual and political and all these grasps of power that feel completely separate, but in reality, we're all doing the same thing. It's more intertwined than we realize. Bear with me for a second because I don't want this to become an overly political statement. Again, this is pretty generalized, but it helps you understand where I'm coming from. A lot of Christians today who have adopted a more politically liberal viewpoint also live in the side where faith is vastly accepting of spirituality, of being guided by our emotions, of being our authentic selves, and we live in that whoever you are, whatever you're doing is okay. And that also tends to line up with a more liberal political viewpoint. On the flip side of that, there's a whole group of Christians that would politically support the more conservative side, and you see a lot of rigidity in their life around getting the right role, the right people in the right roles in the right time of power, and you see them hold the rest of the world at arm's length and, pull my kids out of school and all these different things so that they can have this illusion of power. It's still to this day all about control. On either side of that, the illusion of control of as long as I can be whoever I am, or as long as everybody else does what I say I can do, I'm controlling the circumstances. You might be thinking, I don't feel like either one of these descriptions fit me. I'm going to get in your world just a little bit more. Have you ever been told, or have you ever believed that if I pray for something just exactly right, if I fold my hands a certain way, or if I say it the right number of times, or if I find the exact right words, then I will get the result that I'm looking for? Worship team, you can come on forward. See, this is the real honest truth, if I can lay it out for a moment. We are utterly and completely powerless. We have no control over the chaos of the world. We are simply stewards of the things God has given us, like our bodies or our money or our families. And He expects us to take responsibility for these things and make good choices. But we have no real control. Moses could not have brought those plagues to pass on his own. The magicians couldn't fight him. Moses couldn't have done it on his own. But God was able to work through him. We see in the New Testament, what we do see in the absence of magic is that Jesus walks with a very similar amount of power and authority. And the only difference is He doesn't have to get the direction immediately from God to do it because He is God. But Matthew 21, it shows us this verse. Early in the morning, as Jesus was on His way back to the city, He was hungry. He saw a fig tree by the road. He went up to it and found nothing on it except leaves. Then He said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." Immediately, the tree withered. We see this vast power demonstrated again, right? With just a single word, He carries the power of life and death. We see Him raise people to life. We see Him cure blindness with spit and mud. We see this sense of magic time and time again. But it is with the power and authority of God that these magical things happen, these miraculous things happen. And multiple times throughout His ministry, you will hear Jesus claim that we also have the ability to carry this power and authority. You may have heard this verse, Philippians 4:13. It says, "I can do all things through Him who gives me strength." I think, unfortunately, we read this verse like this, those capital letters in the front. I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. In reality, we need to read it like this. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. But we are nothing without the strength of Christ. In fact, without Him, we would be doomed to a life of sin with no redemption. No magic could save us then, but nothing else could either. I think as Christians, another question that pops up for us a lot is like, why did Jesus' death have to be so intense, so horrific? He was beaten, he was crucified, mocked, tormented, spit on. Why did it have to be that way? Perhaps the brutality of Jesus' death is a reminder for us. He walked the earth as a human, and perhaps it was a reminder that while we as humans possess an amazing power and strength to withstand torture, crucifixion, whatever it is, whatever circumstances in our own life, because God designed us to be able to withstand, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, we are weak and we are breakable. Unless we rely on him and we allow his power to reign, then we humans can also conquer death through him who gives me strength.